Why did China did it had their own advanced, almost serious scientific revolution as the Roman Empire did? For people who don't know, before the crisis of the third century, which led to the downfall of Rome, there was a significant technological scientific innovation progress to the point that if the Roman Empire didn't fail, they could easily achieve a scientific revolution. Because from the second century, the scientific method was created by Galen, Ptolemy, and Hero Alexandria, create the foundation of the scientific method, which we didn't see until the 20th century from people like Karl Popper, with falsification, experimentation, rationalism, even proto-examples of pragmatism. So what happened? Why did China and other societies in the world did they achieve the same thing? Well, for three reasons: cultural differences, and what is considered valuable and not valuable within the society, environmental conditions that prevent certain innovation to achieve, and three, also religious reasons that what they could see as a priority and what considered heresy at the time. An article written by a PhD in the history of science, especially in antiquity, Richard Carrier. Although I do not subscribe to his party, he does a great summary in what made the difference of Rome versus China in antiquity. It's often asked why the scientific revolution only occurred in Europe and not in China, which as normalization affected scientific method across at least literate society. As he's documented, the Roman Empire at its peak was on the verge of this, and in any way China never was, falling short only in two steps that were fully realized until the course of the 17th century. A clear, consistent demarcation among scientific researchers between reliable and unreliable methods are more or less universal accepted of this fact among the literate, intellectual, and political elite. Romans have their own method usually credited to the scientific revolution, whereas China did not. They just used them alongside more speculative philosophical method as well, producing more of a mixed bag, slowing the pace and scale of progress. To be clear, a terminological demarcation between science and philosophy did not occur during the scientific revolution. It would have been realized until the 20th century. But the demarcation between methods recognized what we now call philosophy as subordinate and less authoritative was that the 17th century established in Europe, and even that did not happen overnight. Likewise, though there was a lot of respect and enthusiasm for science among the Roman elite, they had not yet made this a dominant aspect of their culture. In the way Newton's principle finally achieved. For example, there were many calls to create something like the Imperial Society of Rome for improving natural knowledge, such as the idea haven't hit high enough of any emperor's radar before the effective collapse of Roman civilization began in the 3rd century. So I think we can more or less explain why the scientific revolution didn't happen in ancient Rome. Various attempts at explaining this were explored by H. Flores Cohens. As I summarize much of that, and there I think evidence actually leads to the question and why. It was Cohen's survey, in fact, that largely inspired the Richard Carrier's PhD thesis in Columbia University. This short of it is that it speaks the first and second century of our area. The Roman Empire has achieved the same level of intellectual, industrial, and economic accomplishment would later characterize 16th century Europe. And all the same trends toward the ideas of the scientific revolution can be found in 2nd century scientific writings of the Roman era. There isn't really any empirical argument to be made that Rome would have continued at the same course of the same conclusion and have not characteristically declined in the very next century, which was dominated by 50-year-long civil war ending the total collapse of the auxiliary economy, the equivalent of the Great Depression, to which the response was doubly upon on fascism and mysticism, and the collapse of the Roman Empire, which statistically speaking is the 5th most violent event in human history. So the event was so catastrophic that led to a dark age throughout the year 400 to the year 800 to 1000. Simply ran with the accelerated note it took its reign. It was all down from here. The essential put the West in holding patterns for 1,000 years, half of which was in an era of ruin, and the other a long slow slug back into the level which things had been once. Commonly it was called the Renaissance for a reason. It marked the rebirth of Bacon ideas and valued that was driven steady scientific, industrial, and philosophical progress, and really only one thing differed. One Europe was on its wax, not in its wane, just at the time. It was thus continued to improve economically and industrially, and thus also intellectually after that point. But what explains China's failure to beat us to it? After we really host this, with the rise of Christendom, we have fatally fumbled the whole ball for 1,000 years, because Christianity was basically at its beginning founded on anti-intellectualism against philosophy and science and Greek education at the time. Plenty of the time for China to have caught up, but also in contention, of course, with the Islamic world, which for a period between 800 to 1100 AD flirted with its own renaissance. Also, like the later Renaissance and Christendom, built on the shoulders of Greco-Roman science, which will have evolved in a bona fide scientific revolution, and indeed it would be done so centuries before the West caught up. There really no other civilization that can come anywhere near this development. We know what happened to Islam. Fundamentalism took over, and the rise until the 11th century, when religion study was prioritized over scientific studies, and even as late at the very end of the golden age of Islam, like the 15th century, it's been stated by some scholars they reject the Greek concept of a sphere ball and prefer the flat world because the Quran says so. Essentially fucked the entire Islamic world for 1,000 years in a manner very similar to that Christendom in the West. Only Christianity fucking of society started centuries earlier, and that it was due to a clock out before Islam all similar mistakes did. Thus Islam gave up the lead and let the West pass on the race to finish the line. China plainly flirted with similar behavior much earlier. Vicious purchase of books and intellectuals in the 3rd century BC, for example, and lesser suppression of intellectualism continued to recur under almost every dynasty. Therefore, most notoriously under the early modern Qing dynasty, right after when U.S. scientific revolution was underway, a classic case of really bad timing. But the worst of this was the earlier purchase, and China reached its peak in following centuries, such as during the Han Dynasty, in fact almost exactly tracing the timeline of the Roman Empire on the other side of the planet, and China continued to achieve technological advances ever after. Industrially, it remained comparable to Rome at its height for most of its existence, but it simply stagnated there. Thus it was unprepared when the Western industrial enterprise arrived, too far behind to ever really catch up to them on its own. But why did China never get anywhere at this rate, despite having literally thousands of years to figure it out? The best sufficient answer to this question is laid out by Alec Kroeber on Common Sense. Its overall point, real science requires development and deploying method contrary to all natural human institutions. It therefore cannot be expected even to commonly raise, much less than dominate society, though it isn't really an explanation so much as simply a description of the problem. But Kroeber unlike some casual factors, including China's persistent bent toward isolationism and conservatism after Han era, resulting in an active disinterest in intellectual progress beyond certain acceptable parameters. One can still ask why was the case, and so to answer questions like that, one has to go deeper for most solid scholarly background. The place to start will be the latest summary what happened differently in Greece and China by most renowned and prolific expert of the comparative history of science in China and Greece, G.E.R. Lloyd. Takes the big picture view and cite via notes and bibliography all the leading and most currently works of the subject, using like the Franker school of the longue durée. Lloyd has devoted his entire career to the subject and has written numerous excellent books on the very aspects of the question I am asking today. So the latest summary will get you on the whole story. You need to explore particularly. I will put link in the description of the books, etc. But for a important example, see Ambitions of Curiosity, which also used Mesopotamia as an analog and a vast civilization that for many thousands of years never even got near a scientific revolution. And in Egypt, for example, they were even as far back as the Middle Kingdom and the Old Kingdom. They were having their own scientific innovation, but because of the theocratic rule of the pharaohs as god kings, and they want to oppress, they don't want to span education to everybody else because it threatened their power in the nation state. So science became scholasticism, and scholasticism reduced to magic for 1,000 years until the first ever recorded social revolution happened, where people want to go back into an anarchist communist lifestyle of their past ancestors, which focus on the negative and the positives of their different cultural milieus. I studied the same subject since my entire undergraduate days at Berkeley. This is the words of the Richard Carrier. working under David Keightley as one of his protégés at the time, taking his course in ancient China and cross-cultural study of death customs, which compared to ancient China, Greece, Asia, and Sumer. He helped me on numerous personal projects stemming from all questions I had of an expert in ancient China. Did ancient China have atheist, science, belief in hell, knowledge of the Roman Empire? The answer all the days is yes, by the way. Was the principal conflict between Taoism and Confucianism? Not much, to be honest. And beyond Mr. Berkeley's honor thesis, for example, was comparative study of ancient Chinese, Greek, and Roman conception of the hero of the soul, and the possible interaction and connection between those two concepts. Throughout his history, what passed for science in China was really either just craft knowledge, like medicine, engineering, and astronomy throughout the world before Greco-Roman systemization, formalization, and improvements, or philosophy, lacking any formalized empirical method, indeed lacking even much of a way of formalized logic or mathematics. In fact, like if you look and compare the history of mathematical logic in China, it was almost non-existent. Well, in Roman Empire, especially in the second century, they already an early version of probability theory, although the century came in and stopped all that, sadly. China never developed any syllogistic education or axiomatic mathematical system, did not even like upon the notion of formal proofs, only work up practical tools on trial error basis. As Chad Hansen was pointing in the Euclid Encyclopedia of Philosophy, technical classical China has semantic theory but no logic. They were really not only interested in working how to analyze what people say, it was mostly for ethical political debate. There was not much interest in systematic exploring why various systematic analysis work and don't work, nor go around to using such knowledge much for resolving debates, but how natural works and why. And to make matters worse, even they have in a way of this kind of philosophy, suffer under cyclical bouts of anti-intellectualism all across China, and the most recent example is the Cultural Revolution. In the sense, you could say China is always so obsessed with the practical that it all too often never saw enough value in the theoretical. Though theory abundant, it was mostly speculative rather than empirical. The Chinese never made proper connection between theory and practice, and thus never discover or never conceive a wide enough segment of the elite to accept. And even to this day, China, which is dialectical materialist, still has the same problem not mixing theory with practice. And when it does, it leads to failure. Dialectical materialism is false. It's been proven over and over again that it does not work. In history, under Marxist analysis in history, it shows dialectical materialism does not work. When deployed correctly, theoretical achievement is a powerful engine of practical advances. China also never fostered general culture in which debate rather than obedience regarded the facts of reality was seen as acceptable or valuable, at least after the Han Dynasty, or any period of time of sufficient length to jumpstart an intellectual revolution such as consumed ancient Greek and Rome. One can even say this is a real example of extended discussion of Roman Empire during even the Han Dynasty, the most amenable to intellectual progress of any to follow. Normally, Chinese always knew more about the Romans than vice versa, and we had extended description of visual reports from emissaries that China sent to gather intel on the distinct rival. Yet suspiciously absent from these in any discussion of logic, mathematics, science, and even philosophy. They were mainly concerned with oddities of Roman state management and administration, and to a smaller extent technology, economic, industry. And in China, they mostly focus like Buddhism and Taoism on the esotericism, occultism, and mysticism. And that's why there's a lot of literature about myth than philosophy proper per se. But again, I always look for superficial and the practical. Importantly, the Chinese were always, in result, very empirical, and culturally we were very atheist throughout their history. They didn't have much concept of God. They have spirits, but not gods in the sense of like, how we, separate the distinction between God and ghosts and creator God. They lacked that. Lao Tzu, the founder of Tao, was an atheist and didn't believe nature of the Tao. And Confucius was also an atheist. He was have an agnostic view of the afterlife as well in his writings. And Buddhists have a scholastic tradition of atheism in China as well. So there you go. Importantly, the Chinese were always and result very empirical. Yet they would never make cultural connection between empirical and theoretical. As a consequence, their advancement were always still limited to only what you could observe and do directly. As double point, instead of pursuing abstract and logical concerns, Chinese mathematics, like Chinese science, developed a rich tradition of empirical observation. However, there was not a theoretical orientation that sought to lead the world of physical experience and practical implication behind a world to construct and test purely theoretical models and explanatory framework. And it turns out this is extremely limited. If you are only theoretical and non-empirical, you get flights of fancy mythology, no real progress in any reality, like Homeric Greece and ancient Israel. If you are empirical but untheoretical, you can accomplish a lot of practical craft knowledge, but you can't really get anything deeper. And to put two together, which is both empirical and theoretical, you have pragmatism, and Hilary Pullman today, scientific method today, and mathematical logic today, and philosophy today in the academy. Science required to produce unification of both, building on the method of formalized hypotheses, models, causal and structural theories that develop reliable way to test them for experimental accuracy. This never happened in China. They have a verificationist empiricism, hence craft knowledge, but not falsification empiricism, like Sextant Empirics in the 2nd century Roman Empire. China does never even come close to the scientific revolution the way ancient Rome did. If ancient Rome haven't, neither will the Western Europe have, for without those Greco-Roman foundations have been there to recover, there would have been no Renaissance, and if there was, it would be a lot later than we currently did. Forming out the idea they carry. There is evidence and result as well as methods. As for methods, we can discern the difference in a complete absence from Chinese history, the most reliable Greco-Roman scientific methodologies. As for result, the Chinese never figured out that the Earth was a sphere or that it orbited the Sun, nor ever developed anything we could recognize mathematical laws of planetary motion like Ptolemy's law of equal angles in equal times, then Kepler later built in equal areas in equal times, or his history of eccentricity, the approximate elliptical motion, or even heliocentrism goes back to the Samos of ancient Greeks. There was a few instances of purely speculative suggested that the Earth might be a sphere, but never of any empirical basis, because empirically demonstrate that required theoretical foundation. For example, we see Han Dynasty argument from analogy that Earth has to be the same shape as the heavens, and the heaven looks round, but this does not what we call scientific thinking. Such a theory never became popular anyway. In biology, likewise, for example, Chinese never figured out what the Reynolds system does or how it works, as Galen from Rome did, nor ever localized brain functions as Herophilius did. Never even figured out that the brain produces all human thought, continuing style attribute to the heart or the other organs until modern Western science arrived to correct them, and developed still opposed by many Chinese traditionalists and many New Age voodoo bullshit in YouTube. In the end, if you want to answer the question, why did China not achieve a scientific revolution, we may have to accept the fact that the answer is because pretty much not one did. No one did. Mesopotamia, Mesoamerica, Egypt, although they were close, but the people in power oppressed that, so sadly for them they were close but yet so far. India, Persia, etc. Not one of them even came close as ancient Rome did, and Rome only did because it equally embraced and built on the achievements of Greece. So it really comes down to why did Greece come up with all this? Formalization of logic and mathematics, deduction, syllogism, axiomatic proof, theoretical rather than merely practical understanding, answering the question of every physical and mathematical peculiarity, not just how but why, and how can we really know that? Likewise, systemized, hypothetical empirical science that actually become more accurate over time. It's a method allowing to abandon bad ideas, start elevating sound ones rather than just continue to accumulate and reverse speculating fancy as consume much of traditional Chinese medicine, astronomy, and physics. They are all Greek achievements with subsequent political, economic, and industrial success of the Roman Empire. They are allowed to accumulate further and probably will have made it to what we mean by scientific revolution by the 4th and 5th century. While if fortunes grows rather than fallen, everything instead going to shit in the third century and are recovering intellectually for well over 1,000 years. China was thus no different than any other advanced civilization. It was actually a typical human society on this specific intellectual merit. Typical human society simply never developed what we mean by science. They only achieved craft knowledge, which is not a bad thing. But still, we have administrative documents from Mesopotamia that date back to almost 3000 BC, which meant it well over 4,000 years without ever hitting on the innovation the Greeks did, with some rare exception of mathematical knowledge like the Pythagorean theorem. We were surprised that neither did China, merely 3,000 years of time. Perhaps the surprising thing is that China's intellectual sophistication between the Qin dynasty, 3rd century BC, through the Qing dynasty ending 19th century AD were extraordinarily impressive, arguably more so than any other great civilization outside of the West can claim. Its technological and engineering achievement unmatched is likewise philosophy and mathematics semantics to a close approximation it had to logic. So one wonders how it could achieve all that and still get no further than Sumer and Egypt in the respect of formal logic and science and mathematics. The answer is probably the same. We are simply falsely equating all that with science. When we speak of formal science, logic, mathematics, we are actually referring to something extremely bizarre in the human ethnographic record, a counterintuitive paradigm shift in how we accumulate the equivalent of philosophical and craft knowledge. Understood as such, it's not surprising that China didn't develop because it here means something fundamentally different from what China did do. They have a different understanding of what it means, linguistically speaking, while merely excel above all what all civilizations do, which is merely accumulating philosophical craft knowledge that nevertheless remains scattered with their sea of errors, fantasy, and bad idea all given the same weight. The only happened when you had no conception how to tell the difference between these two, and so really the secret sauce is simply a remarkable, indeed clearly extraordinary, rare discovery in how to tell the difference. Roman Empire called that far, but only because it had the virtue of enthusiastically adopting what a good idea inclined from conquered cultures, for the spoke wheel of the Celts, to the globe class of the Syrians, to the entire intellectual apparatus of the Greeks. China had no Greeks to learn from and build on. So we get back down to the question why not China, but rather why Greece? To be fair, contrary to those claims, historians cannot answer counterfactuals. Every postulate historical casual theory entails a corresponding counterfactual. You cannot claim to know what caused the scientific revolution, World War II, or the American Revolution, or anything else, without claiming to know what wouldn't have caused it. Because the only way to claim to know what caused an outcome is to know what caused if we remove them will not have the outcome. That is in fact what it means to be by those are the causes. If after removing them from made no difference to the outcome, clearly they did not cause the outcome. So we certainly can't answer the question like why did the Chinese not achieve the scientific revolution? All we to do is answer the question, what did cause the scientific revolution? Because if we really had the answer to the question, then by definition we know the answer to the other. Because the other causes are the causes. Their necessity must be observed as absent China, for there aren't there. Clearly we have failed to identify the actual causes. And in fact for the answer cause the scientific, we discovered right over that. Specifically, atomists of Epicurus and Lucretius in the 11th century revived the idea of the atom by Thomas Robb, John Locke, etc., and Francis Bacon. I used this reasoning to answer the corresponding question why Rome did not experience what we today see the scientific revolution or the industrial revolution, which are not the same thing on both. So why? And the short answer is they almost did. The only thing that can confidently trace is having stopped them with the collapse before the payoff. But China never even became a contender, which must be because of the lack in China of whatever was led the Greek, so uniquely light upon the fundamental tools of formal systematic logic. Mathematics is a science that actually makes the difference between merely accumulated practice craft knowledge and actually be able to tell the difference between credible and fanciful description, explanation, and understanding about the external world. It will great for some other to continue, but first I did complete. And you can see that despite that, at least thankfully we went back where we started, and if we keep doing another form of anti-intellectualism, what happened in the 70s, the rise of anti-intellectualism in China during the Cultural Revolution, the rise of conservatism, neoliberalism, anti-nuclear movement, hinder our progress, which in the 70s we already met the material precondition to become a sci-fi style civilization. Because all these things happen, provide any chance to actually achieve an anarchist revolution, which by the way, by all experts, especially archaeology and anthropology, we met the material conditions to achieve anarchic communist society as our hunter-gatherer ancestors did. Is to start a revolution now or we'll never achieve our goals to a truly harmonized society.